Before horror became a streaming algorithm, before Blu-rays, collector's editions, and endless reboots, there was the rental shelf. Rows of clamshells and cardboard sleeves, lined with screaming faces and blood-red titles. It was a different time, one where discovery meant walking the aisles, judging a movie by the cover art, the bit of text on the back, a few small images, and hoping the tape you went for wasn't already rented out. These were the horror films that defined the VHS era, the ones you found tucked in the back of the store, worn down from too many late fees and repeat viewings. And years later, Hollywood brought many of them back. Louder, slicker, and cleaner, reborn for the DVD, Blu-ray, and streaming generations. Some stayed true to their roots. Others lost their soul somewhere in the transfer. This is From VHS Horror Rentals to Modern Remakes Part 1, a look back at the originals that terrified an era, and the modern versions that tried to recapture their magic. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, remade as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2003. Before the 2003 remake turned it into a slick, blood-soaked reboot for the DVD generation, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 was something else entirely. Raw, dirty, and unnervingly real. It didn't just scare people, it scarred them. Directed by Tobe Hooper and shot in the relentless Texas heat on a shoestring budget, the original feels less like a movie and more like a documentary that stumbled onto madness. It follows a group of friends traveling through rural Texas who stumble upon a family of cannibals, including the now legendary Leatherface, a hulking killer who wears the skin of his victims. There's almost no blood in the film, but it feels drenched in it. The power of Texas Chainsaw isn't in what it shows. It's in what it feels like. Every frame is soaked in sweat, dirt, and decay. The sound of that chainsaw, the screams, the dinner scene, it's chaos that feels too real to be staged. For audiences in 1974, it was like watching a snuff film that escaped the editing room. When it hit VHS, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre became a rite of passage. You didn't just rent it. You survived it. It was the kind of tape you had to rewind in silence afterward, just to make sure you were still breathing. It embodied everything the VHS horror boom would become: raw, underground, and unforgettable. The 2003 remake, produced by Michael Bay and directed by Marcus Nispel, took that same nightmare and rebuilt it for a new era. It's grittier, darker, and drenched in style. Slick cinematography, booming sound design, and a Leatherface who feels unstoppable. It replaced the documentary realism of the original with a kind of operatic brutality. Jessica Biel led a new cast of doomed travelers, and while the story beats were familiar, the tone was pure early 2000s horror. Mean, beautiful, and unrelenting. Some fans missed the grain and grit of the original. Others saw the remake as the rare one that actually worked. It captured the spirit of the story, the hopelessness, the rot, even if it traded grime for gloss. The 1974 version still feels like lightning in a bottle, a horror movie so real it feels cursed. On VHS, it didn't play like a film. It played like a warning, a shaky home video from the edge of hell. Prom Night, 1980, remade as Prom Night, 2008. Before the 2008 remake turned it into a glossy teen scream thriller, Prom Night from 1980 was one of the defining slashers of the early VHS era. A cold, revenge-fueled story wrapped in disco lights and high school drama. Directed by Paul Lynch and starring Jamie Lee Curtis fresh off Halloween, the original follows a group of teenagers haunted by a terrible childhood accident. Years later, as Prom Night arrives, a masked killer begins stalking them one by one. It's a simple premise, but it's elevated by its atmosphere. The dance floor sparkles with color, the score pulses with disco beats, and Curtis brings that same grounded strength that made her a horror icon. Unlike many of its bloodier contemporaries, Prom Night relied on tension and build-up rather than shock value. You knew someone was going to die, but you didn't know when or who. That uncertainty made it perfect for VHS audiences looking for suspense rather than splatter. The movie's slow burn, grainy look, and almost melancholy tone set it apart from the louder slashers that came later. Prom night became a staple rental for anyone chasing that post-Halloween thrill. Its mix of teenage guilt, revenge, and neon-lit tragedy gave it staying power. It felt rooted in its era, that late 70s and early 80s crossover, when horror still had one foot in mystery and the other in the growing slasher craze. The 2008 remake, directed by Nelson McCormick, updated the story but stripped it down to fit the polished mold of mid-2000 horror. Gone were the masks, mystery, and revenge angle, replaced by a more straightforward stalker narrative set in a luxury hotel. Brittany Snow played the lead, and while the production looked slick, it lacked the grit and sadness that made the original linger. It was horror redesigned for the multiplex, safe, clean, and marketable. The two films couldn't feel more different. The 1980 original dances between tragedy and terror, the 2008 version glides through its scares like a pop song on repeat. One leaves you uneasy, the other leaves you entertained. On VHS, Prom night was raw emotion, flickering lights, sweaty faces, and the sound of a killer moving just out of sight. Suspiria, 1977. Remade as Suspiria, 2018. Before Luca Guadagnino's 2018 remake turned it into a hypnotic fever dream of politics and pain, Suspiria from 1977 was pure nightmare. A sensory explosion that redefined what horror could look like on film, and one of the most visually striking movies ever to haunt a VHS player. Directed by Dario Argento, the original follows Susie Bannion, an American ballet student who arrives at a prestigious German dance academy, only to discover it's run by a coven of witches. But Suspiria isn't about story as much as experience. It's color, sound, and movement, an assault on the senses. Every hallway is bathed in neon light, every scream punctuated by goblins pounding chaotic score. It feels less like watching a movie, and more like stepping into a dream that won't let you wake up. Argento's film is art and horror fused into one. The lighting, the architecture, the otherworldly atmosphere, every frame feels painted, not filmed. It's brutal, beautiful, and utterly unique. When Suspiria hit VHS, it was a revelation for horror fans. The colors bled through the screen, the sound seemed to hum through the static, and even through the imperfections of tape, it felt alive. It wasn't just a movie you rented. It was a nightmare you brought home. The 2018 remake, directed by Luca Guadagnino, took Argento's kaleidoscopic vision and inverted it completely. Gone were the bright colors and fairy tale energy, replaced with cold grays, muted tones, and the weight of history. Set against the backdrop of divided Berlin, this Suspiria became something deeper, a story about control, guilt, and rebirth. The witchcraft was still there, but the real horror came from power. Who holds it? Who suffers for it? And what it costs to break free. It's slower, heavier, and more meditative, replacing Argento's dream logic with emotional gravity. Tilda Swinton's multiple roles blur identity and authority, while Tom York's mournful score replaces Goblin's chaos with quiet despair. It's not trying to outdo the original. It's responding to it, like two halves of the same spell cast 40 years apart. Both films are mirrors of their time, Argento's version vibrant and surreal, the height of expressionist horror. Guadagnino's, somber and introspective, horror is art and reflection. Together they feel like a conversation between nightmares. The original Suspiria was pure madness, a painting that screamed, a dream you couldn't shake. The 2018 version simply reminded us that the spell was never broken. Hellraiser, 1987, remade as Hellraiser, 2022. Before the 2022 reimagining brought the Cenobites back in high definition, Hellraiser from 1987 was a nightmare straight from the video store shelves, a film that looked like nothing else, felt like nothing else, and became a legend in the VHS horror era. Written and directed by Clive Barker from his own novella The Hellbound Heart, the original follows a woman, her lover, and a mysterious puzzle box that opens the doorway to another dimension, one ruled by beings who blur the line between pleasure and pain. They're not demons, they're explorers, led by a figure who became an icon of horror, Pinhead. Shot on a modest budget, Hellraiser was a film that dripped with texture, rust, flesh, leather, and blood. Barker's direction combined the grotesque and the sensual in a way that few dared to attempt. It wasn't just gory. It was elegant in its cruelty. The effects were practical and raw, every torn muscle and chain rendered with grim precision. It wasn't a movie for everyone, but for those who found it, it was unforgettable. On VHS, Hellraiser felt forbidden. It was one of those tapes you had to hide under the bed, a film whispered about more than it was described. The low lighting, the otherworldly sound design, the philosophical horror. It made you feel like you were watching something you weren't supposed to see. It wasn't about fear of death. It was fear of desire itself. The 2022 version, directed by David Bruckner, approached the mythology with reverence and reinvention. This time, the lead configuration of pain and beauty was a female pinhead, played by Jamie Clayton, whose calm menace gave the film a cold, ceremonial feel. The tone was slick and deliberate, balancing Barker's original themes of obsession and transcendence with modern precision. Where the original was grime and nightmare, the new Hellraiser was ritual and architecture. A beautiful machine made of suffering. It wasn't trying to replace the original. It was bringing the mythology back to life, sharper and colder than ever. The two films reflect the evolution of horror itself, from VHS-era transgression to streaming-era sophistication. But both share the same heart: curiosity that destroys, desire that damns. On VHS, Hellraiser was the tape you played once and never forgot. A riddle, a warning, and a promise carved in blood. It, 1990, remade as It, 2017. Before the 2017 remake turned Pennywise into a box office phenomenon, It from 1990 was a generation-shared nightmare, a made-for-TV miniseries that haunted the VHS era long after it aired. Based on Stephen King's massive novel, the original It follows a group of kids in the town of Derry, Maine, who band together to fight an ancient evil that takes the form of whatever they fear most often a clown named Pennywise. Though it was made for television, the two-part event became a VHS staple, with Tim Curry's unforgettable performance turning him into one of horror's most iconic villains. Curry's Pennywise wasn't just scary, he was alive. His performance danced between humor and malice, making him unpredictable and deeply unsettling. The production had its limitations, but that almost worked in its favor. The cheapness, the lighting, the eerie small-town atmosphere. It all felt real in that late-night TV kind of way. For kids who snuck a rental off the shelf, It was nightmare fuel that stuck with them for decades. When it arrived on VHS, it spread like an urban legend. There was something about watching it at home, on a flickering tube TV, that made it feel personal, like Pennywise could crawl right through the static. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was the fear of growing up, of forgetting, of realizing the monsters you fought as a kid might still be waiting for you. The 2017 remake, directed by Andy Muschietti, reimagined the story with blockbuster scale and stunning attention to detail. Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise was less human, more otherworldly, a creature of jerky movements, dead eyes, and alien hunger. The new version leaned into trauma, nostalgia, and friendship, with each child's fear rendered through gorgeous, horrifying set pieces. It was modern horror at its most confident, a love letter to the source material and to the fans who grew up with the original tape. Both versions work for different reasons. The 1990 miniseries is nostalgic horror, handmade and rough around the edges. The 2017 film is its reflection, sleek, cinematic, and crafted for a new audience. One terrified the VHS generation, the other reintroduced that fear to their kids. In the 90s, it didn't need theater sound or Dolby effects. Just the whir of the tape and that voice calling from the drain. We all float down here. Maniac, 1980. Remade as Maniac, 2012. Before the 2012 remake gave the story a glossy first-person twist, Maniac from 1980 was one of the most disturbing and unforgettable horror films of its era. A grimy, sweat-stained look inside the mind of a killer that could have only come out of New York's Grindhouse scene. Directed by William Lustig and starring Joe Spinell, the film follows Frank Zito, a deeply broken man who prowls the streets at night, murdering women and collecting their scalps to decorate mannequins in his tiny apartment. It sounds sensational, but the movie plays it deadly straight. Spinell's performance is uncomfortably human, sad, lonely, and terrifying all at once. Shot guerrilla style on the streets of Manhattan, Maniac captures a city rotting from the inside out. The camera lingers on the sleaze, flickering neon signs, grimy subways, rain-slicked streets. It feels less like fiction and more like a documentary from a nightmare. The violence is unflinching, thanks in part to Tom Savini's infamous head explosion effects, still shocking decades later. When Maniac hit VHS, it came wrapped in controversy. Many stores refused to carry it. Others hid it behind the counter. But for collectors, that just made it more desirable. A forbidden film that pushed the boundaries of what horror could show. The 2012 remake, starring Elijah Wood, flipped the perspective, literally filming almost the entire movie from the killer's point of view. It was stylish and unsettling, but cleaner, more controlled. What it couldn't replicate was the filth and authenticity of the original. A film that felt like it was shot in the very alleys it condemned. The 1980 Maniac is the kind of movie you don't just watch. You survive it. It's uncomfortable, relentless, and essential to understanding the darker, grittier side of VHS-era horror. The Amityville Horror, 1979, remade as The Amityville Horror, 2005. Before the 2005 remake turned it into a slick, fast-paced haunted house story, The Amityville Horror from 1979 was a slow-burning nightmare, a chilling blend of suburban anxiety, true crime fascination, and supernatural dread that helped define the haunted house craze of the VHS era. Directed by Stuart Rosenberg and based on Jay Anson's best-selling book, the film follows George and Kathy Lutz, a young couple who move into their dream home in Amityville, New York, a house where a gruesome mass murder had taken place just a year earlier. At first it seems perfect, but soon strange noises, foul smells, and violent outbursts begin to tear the family apart. Something in the house wants them gone. James Brolin and Margot Kidder anchor the story with grounded performances that make the haunting feel disturbingly real. Brolin's slow descent into paranoia and rage is especially haunting. A man losing himself to a force he can't understand. The film doesn't rely on flashy effects. It builds fear through suggestion, atmosphere, and silence. The house itself becomes a living thing, creaking, groaning, watching. Part of what made the Amityville Horror so effective in 1979 was its connection to the based on a true story hook. Whether you believed it or not didn't matter. The movie treated it with total sincerity, letting your imagination do most of the work. It's that uneasy blend of domestic familiarity and lurking evil that makes it timeless. When it hit VHS, the film became a must-rent title for every horror fan. Its ominous score, dim lighting, and dated texture gave it an authenticity that modern horror rarely captures. Watching it on tape felt like peering into something cursed, a story that was never meant to leave the house it came from. The 2005 remake, directed by Andrew Douglas and starring Ryan Reynolds, amped up the pacing and visuals for a new generation. It's stylish and aggressive, with sharper scares and darker energy, but it misses the eerie patience that made the original so unnerving. The 1979 version doesn't scream. It whispers. And that whisper sticks with you long after it's over. The Amityville Horror endures because it captures something universal. The fear that the place we're supposed to feel safest might be the thing that destroys us. On VHS, it felt haunted before the first frame even rolled, as if the tape itself didn't want to be played. House of Wax, 1953, remade as House of Wax, 2005. Before the 2005 remake turned it into a glossy Paris Hilton slasher, House of Wax from 1953 was a landmark, one of the first major studio horror films shot in 3D and a gothic masterpiece that blended tragedy with terror. Directed by André de Toth and starring Vincent Price in one of his most iconic roles, the film follows Professor Henry Jared, a talented sculptor who loses everything when his wax museum is set ablaze by his business partner. Left disfigured and presumed dead, Jared returns years later to reopen his museum. But his new figures look disturbingly lifelike. The original House of Wax isn't just a horror film. It's a story of obsession, art, and revenge. Price gives a haunting, layered performance, sympathetic one moment, monstrous the next, embodying the madness of a man whose art has consumed him. The film's use of color and depth was groundbreaking, making its wax creations shimmer with an eerie realism that was stunning for the era. De Toth, ironically blind in one eye and unable to even see the 3D effect himself, directed with confidence and style. Every frame feels theatrical, almost operatic, as if the wax figures themselves are watching the audience. The result is both beautiful and unsettling, a film that walks the line between art and atrocity. When it hit VHS decades later, House of Wax stood out among the grimy slashers of the 1980s. It was elegant, eerie, and atmospheric, proof that horror didn't need buckets of blood to get under your skin. It had sophistication, yet it still dripped with madness. The 2005 remake reimagined the title as a brutal backwoods nightmare, trading Price's tragedy for youthful carnage. It's fun in its own right, stylish, loud, and full of gore, but it lacks the melancholic soul of the original. The 1953 version feels timeless, a ghost story about the price of creation and the danger of loving beauty too much. On VHS, its colors bled and shimmered, the wax gleam fading just slightly, which somehow made it even creepier. Candyman, 1992, remade as Candyman, 2021. Before the 2021 reimagining brought him back to haunt a new generation, Candyman from 1992 was one of the most strikingly original horror films of the VHS era. A movie that combined urban legend, social commentary, and supernatural dread into something unforgettable. Directed by Bernard Rose and based on Clive Barker's short story The Forbidden, the original follows Helen Lyle, a graduate student researching Chicago's urban legends. Her curiosity leads her to Cabrini Green, a public housing complex plagued by stories of a hook-handed killer who appears when you say his name 5 times in a mirror. What she finds isn't just a ghost. It's a myth made flesh, born from centuries of pain and injustice. Tony Todd's performance as Candyman is mesmerizing, regal, tragic, and terrifying all at once. He's not just a slasher villain. He's a symbol, a reminder that legends are built on real suffering, elevating it beyond standard horror. And while the story drips with tension and blood, it's the sadness that lingers. A ghost story about the violence that never really leaves. On VHS, Candyman stood out from everything else on the shelf. It was elegant and eerie, steeped in atmosphere, and impossible to forget. It didn't rely on jump scares or one-liners. It was horror that got under your skin and stayed there. For many, it was the first movie that made the supernatural feel tied to something real. Nearly 30 years later, Candyman returned. Directed by Nia DaCosta and produced by Jordan Peele, the 2021 film revisits the same Chicago neighborhood, now gentrified and rebuilt, yet still haunted by the same story. Yahya Abdul-Mateen II stars as an artist drawn into the legend, discovering that Candyman isn't one man at all. It's an idea that endures, a spirit passed from generation to generation. The new film mirrors the old one's themes while reframing them for a modern world, where trauma is inherited and myths evolve alongside the people who tell them. It's sharper, more direct, and visually stunning, using mirrors and reflections not just as scares, but as symbols of memory and identity. Both films share the same core: the power of stories, how they survive, how they spread, and how they shape us. On VHS, Candyman looked almost too beautiful for a horror film. a ghost story captured in static, where every flicker of tape felt like it could summon him if you watched too closely. The Fog, 1980. Remade as The Fog, 2005. Before the forgettable 2005 remake drifted into theaters and disappeared just as quickly, John Carpenter's The Fog rolled across screens in 1980, a moody, ghostly slice of atmospheric horror that proved terror doesn't always need speed or blood. Set in the coastal town of Antonio Bay, California, the film opens on the eve of the town's centennial celebration, when a strange, glowing fog begins to creep in from the sea. Hidden within it are the spirits of drowned sailors seeking revenge for a century-old betrayal. Carpenter co-wrote the film with Deborah Hill and stacked the cast with genre royalty: Jamie Lee Curtis, Janet Leigh, Adrienne Barbeau, and Tom Atkins. The result is pure old-school horror craftsmanship, haunting visuals, slow tension, and that unmistakable Carpenter synth score pulsing underneath it all. On VHS, The Fog became a staple of weekend rentals, the perfect lights-off ghost story. It's not flashy, but it's immersive, pulling you into its misty world, where every foghorn and flicker of light feels like a warning. When Hollywood remade it in 2005, the story was mostly the same, but the soul was gone. The original built its scares out of silence and suggestion. The remake just built noise. Carpenter's The Fog remains a masterclass in less is more horror. It's the kind of movie that reminds you what made the genre work in the first place: atmosphere, mood, and the sense that something unseen is moving toward you in the dark. Even decades later, when that fog starts to roll in, it still feels cursed. Decades later, these stories still hold their power, no matter how many times they're remade, re-released, or reformatted. The grain might fade, the colors might sharpen, but the fear stays the same. The VHS era gave us something raw, horror that felt handmade, imperfect, and real. And even when Hollywood revisits those old nightmares, you can still feel the ghost of the original somewhere underneath all the polish. We'll be diving deeper into that next time, exploring more classic horror that went from the rental shelf to the remake era, and how those new versions kept or lost the spirit of what came before. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.